our third panel, which is entitled State Policy and Local Government Change in New York. I don't plan on talking above you for very long. We have a really good group. I think our panel here is organized around a very important topic regarding what kinds of interventions are working, and then in one case, how is one class of government surviving under the current regime or thriving. So let me introduce our panel. Our first presentation is the durability and dissolution of village government in New York State. The presenter is Lisa Parshall. She's an associate professor of political science and history in the history and political science department at Damon College. Did I screw that up pretty well? Okay. And our second presenter, who is not here yet, is Carl Stenberg, and he's going to be talking about leveraging a paper that he's written with a colleague at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Government. They're working on a project looking more nationally and with a particular focus in New York on leveraging local change, state initiatives to promote service sharing and consolidation. And to some degree, I wish he was here to hear this. Carl's coming back home. He got his PhD here at Albany and has gone on to a very distinguished career. Our third paper is the New York State Financial Restructuring Board of Local Governments for Local Governments by Kevin Bronner, and he's a public service professor at Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy here at Albany. So, Lisa, would you start us off?
Well, I want to start by thanking everyone for having me here today. I feel very honored to be presenting among such wonderful presentations and research. So I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about how I came to this project and then give you an overview of the paper that will be posted to the web in my presentation today. So I'm relatively new, only about 5 years or so, to studying local government reform, and my interest in this topic began in 2010 when we had a push for the dissolution of village governments in Erie County, and there were 3 communities in all that were a citizen-initiated petition after the passage of the Empowerment Act in 2009, the new New York Reorganization and Citizen Empowerment Act. And so I began following these dissolutions, and in all 3 communities, the communities in question, Williamsville was a very affluent community in the suburb of, first-ring suburb of Buffalo. Sloan was a very small, struggling with some dysfunctional government, but a very tight-knit community. And Farnham, very, very small, fiscally stressed community. In all 3 communities, the dissolutions were opposed by local elected officials. In all 3 communities, there was an outsider narrative that the dissolution was being pushed by a local civic activist. In all 3 communities, any evidence of property tax savings was sort of dismissed in favor of the intangibles, that benefits that are provided by village government. And in all 3 communities, dissolution was resoundingly defeated. And I noticed that in the debate narrative, which is what I'm really interested in, the social historical context of this debate, the local elected officials sort of adapted their strategies to the very specifics of the communities. So where Sloan, which was really struggling in Farnham, the dissolution was presented as sort of municipal death and a retrograde. In Williamsville, where the attempt was to talk about dissolution in a more progressive way, that it was a way of towards regionalism, they talked about how wonderful their community was in saving it. And so I looked at this really in the context of, in Western New York, this was really in some ways another push for regionalization. So like the first paper I titled, Another Run at Regionalization. But I recognized very quickly that there were limitations to my research and that it was very much focused on these local cases. I was missing the larger historical context, the legal context. I was missing a lot of the aspects of, why are municipalities incorporated in the first part. So I decided then for the next stage of my research to do a look at the evolution of village dissolution law and to look at dissolution as a statewide and a historical process. And so to do this, I traced the evolution of dissolution procedures, starting with the general village law in 1846 and then forward to 1972 and 2009, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. I also looked at the evolution of municipal home rule, constitutional home rule authority, and then the increased functional parity between counties, towns, and villages. Phase 3, I'll just jump a little bit ahead here. Phase 3 of the research, I received a grant from the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, so I was able to spend some wonderful time with some wonderful people up at the archives looking through the historical records on dissolutions past. And so I have collectively, over the course of New York State history, looked at all of the failed dissolution cases that I could locate and all of the successful dissolutions based on my research at the archives. What I put together then in looking at sort of the evolution of the dissolution procedures was a recognition that our dissolution laws have passed through sort of major paradigms. And the ones that I want to talk about today are sort of the Empowerment Act, and that's where my focus is going to be. But in the early part, before the general village law, village governments were created at local request, but by the legislature. Starting with the village law in 1846, what you see is what I call direct citizen command, where the law was really there for citizens to either incorporate or disincorporate at their command. In 1972, we saw a shift to Article 19 procedures, which I'm going to refer to as Article 19. This was the law in effect from 72 to 2009. And this really was the initiation of a study procedure where the locus of control really shifted to local elected officials. In 2010, under the push of then Attorney General Cuomo, we saw the enactment of the Citizen Empowerment Act, and that's where I'm going to focus today. And this was an attempt, in part, I argue, to restore some of that lost direct command, to take this out of the hands of local elected officials, because what was happening under Article 19 was too many dissolutions were getting stalled in the study process and not going up for a vote. And so this was an attempt to truncate the process by allowing voters with a reduced threshold to get dissolution on the ballot and to command dissolution. And then once the vote was taken for citizen-initiated petitions, then and only then a study would be done. The next slide I just wanted to show you is this puts together sort of the dissolutions that have been successful from the start of New York State. And what you can see here is that the uptick in the interest in dissolution actually predates the Empowerment Act. I also just want to say that the Empowerment Act is only one piece of the puzzle. It really needs to be looked at as in part of a larger state effort to incentivize and encourage municipal mergers. And so that would include local government efficiency grants, which go back to 2005, and then all of the empowerment tax credits, the property tax cap, and the property tax freeze, which are all designed in some ways to increase the pressures on local governments to consider municipal consolidation. So when I first put together my presentation in mid-October for today, there were 7 successful dissolution cases, and then 2 more dissolved the last week of October and 2 more dissolved on November 3rd. So I had to redo my little slides, and it sort of looks, when you look at this, it looks like I made it up, because you'll see the numbers exactly inverse. So under old Article 19 procedures, the success rate of dissolutions that were put to a public vote was about 64%. Under the new Empowerment Act, the defeat rate is about 64%. I would note though that Article 19, one thing that you have to be a little careful of is that the success rate there is probably inflated by the fact that dissolution wouldn't have been put on the ballot except for in cases where there was some support of local elected officials. So a lot of cases, the study process just stalled out and it never actually proceeded to a vote. You can see the Empowerment Act has done at least 3 things. It's made it easier to get dissolution on the ballot through its lower petition threshold. So we do see, again, an uptick, 2.6, again, talk about inversion, 2.6 average over 5 years. Article 19 procedures hang around because some villages had started their dissolutions under those. So you actually had 13 dissolutions that took place after the passage of Empowerment Act that were actually done under Article 19 procedures. But in that time period, about 2.6 dissolutions went up for a vote. Under the Empowerment Act, about 6.2. So that's 31 over 5 years with 11 successful cases. So it's made it easier, the Empowerment Act, to get dissolution on the ballot. It's facilitated the number of communities studying in considering dissolution, and it has shortened the length of the study process considerably. The paper itself, and I won't go into all of these, and this will be available, but the paper looks at those 11 cases and does a little case study of each of them. And just a couple of quick things to point out. One is that the villages that have successfully dissolved are all quite small, so the average population is about 790. If you look at just the study and implementation grants, this is excluding empowerment tax credits and the other incentives. I couldn't calculate that out because these are too fresh. I couldn't get the aggregate total. But just over $500,000 just in study and implementation of the successful cases. If you include failed cases, the state spent since 2005 about $3.3 million just on the study of dissolution. In many of these cases, you'll see I looked at whether there was a plan before a vote. Sometimes there was, even if not required under the Empowerment Act, because the process had actually sort of been begun or dissolution had been discussed, or sometimes just because the village board wanted the voters to have information. I also looked at whether the town officials played any role either in the formulation of a dissolution plan or in offering some assurances, because the dissolution plan is created once dissolution is approved at the polls. It's created by the village board, but the town is the entity that actually implements it. And then in the last column, I just talk a little bit about the level of the contention in each of these cases. In a few of these cases, for example, Altmore, Bridgewater, Prospect, and Forestville, these were communities that were fiscally stressed. They had dysfunction and economic decline. Probably the healthiest community that dissolved here is Lyons, and that was a very contentious case, the first example of Article 78 procedures being used. In the cases that are the most sort of interesting to me, at least, are those where again, the study process is reintroduced even where not required under the Empowerment Act, and where town officials played a major role. One of these, Herman, is sort of a model, I would say, for how it can be done. They actually there, even though not required by law, had the town board approve the dissolution plan before the voters voted. So what I found, and again, looking at the narrative of the debate, is that if you want to wrap up sort of why is dissolution so difficult to get approved, the one word I would say is uncertainty, is that the Empowerment Act is losing the narrative, particularly because it has eliminated the requirement for a study plan before dissolution is put up to a vote, at least in cases of citizen-initiated dissolution. Voters and local elected officials, when they are opposed, and dissolution opponents talk repeatedly about the lack of a plan, that they don't know whether anything that is proposed will actually be implemented or how it will be implemented by the town. In many cases, the town is not involved, town officials are not involved, or eschew getting involved, and so sometimes they offer only vague assurances as to what will happen once dissolution becomes actually carried out. In the narrative, you see, I call it sort of, I'm looking for a better word, but a progressive narrative that sort of associates growth and development from moving from a village to a city, whereas dissolution is often viewed as a retrograde or a form of municipal death. So for some of these communities that are quite fiscally stressed and they're really struggling in terms of their population, to them, dissolving is almost the final capitulation. Some of them are stoic about it. Some say, well, we went from a village to a fire district, and that's evolution for us. Others cling to that identity. And of course, too, even when there's property tax savings projected, and I can say a little more about that, but most of the dissolution debate focuses on property tax savings with a disproportionate amount of focus on what village residents are going to save, and then a little more on what the impact would be on town outside of village voters. But in many cases, even when there's demonstrable savings to be had, because most of these dissolution studies, I did do sort of a meta-evaluation of the dissolution studies that exist, provide opportunities for cost, but how great and how distributed is another question. And even when those projections of proposed savings are there, oftentimes opponents talk about intangibles. They talk about things like community identity, the sense of history, and there's also just familiarity and longevity to these institutions. And another crucial factor, what I'm finding, and I want to tease this out more in future research, is the role of local elected officials. It's much like getting something through Congress, I guess. If the will is there, the information can be provided and answers can be had. If the will is not there, obstruction in information and uncertainty goes way up. One thing that is missing in the debate, again, is sort of this discussion of dissolution as a potential form of community renewal. It's present in a couple of these cases. In Lyons and Macedon in particular, there's two community groups called One Lyons and One Macedon who talk about this as being sort of forward-looking. The same is true in the village of Herman. They looked at the dissolved village of Edwards and they said, why can't we do this too? And they're looking for savings. But that's very rare to actually have sort of the positive part of dissolution as part of the narrative. So one thing I just quickly did, just out of curiosity, I'm sure most of you know this data probably better than I do, but the number of villages that are under 5,000 in population, that's the majority of them. And if you look by comparison at census-designated places or hamlets of comparable size to villages, and I just have the charts there, we could easily double our number of villages if we wanted to. But these are places that maintain an identity and services without their incorporated status. And this is something that could be made part of the debate. Finally, this last slide just shows incorporations by decade. And what you see here is that, again, with changes in functionality between town and village law, the impetus, it takes a certain impetus to create a village and to incorporate. There's a lot of inertia in just maintaining a village incorporation. But in the modern period, as we see here, and especially over the last 15 or so years, we have a very small number of incorporations. Many of those are often defensive to avoid an annexation by neighboring communities. So combining these two graphs together, the dissertation and incorporation trends, what I see is a lot of stasis. And I think, again, understanding in the debate how the narrative is playing out and how it's actually playing out in communities is very important as we move forward with implementing and potentially changing the Empowerment Act. As of now, I would have to conclude that the Empowerment Act is losing the narrative, that it's failed to empower. And because despite all the state incentives and despite the changes in procedures, even as Governor Cuomo says in the end, it's a purely local decision. Thank you.
It's upside down. Good afternoon. I'm going to provide a little bit of a national context for some of the presentations, particularly Lisa's and Kevin's, in terms of leveraging change and focusing on the state's role. This began 3 years ago with some work that we did for ICMA, looking at some of the assumptions that were made by those who looked at the Great Recession as a game changer. Here are some of the ones that were up there. Business as usual approaches won't continue. Cities and counties will reinvent themselves. Economic crisis will drive fundamental and permanent changes in local services and structures, and conditions will vary, but a new normal will be in place, partly because the federal and state cavalry will not arrive to save beleaguered local governments. So those were among the assumptions. The first ICMA white paper, Coping with Crisis, basically looked at the strategies that local governments across the country were trying to put in place to deal with the crisis. The conclusions: most strategies involved cutting expenditures rather than raising revenue, of course. Local officials were reluctant to enter into collaborative arrangements and were much more interested in privatizing. But restructuring remained an unpopular option. That led us to a second study. It was published in the State and Local Government Review of bankruptcies. 75 bankruptcies that occurred between 1971, 2005, and the question we asked was, so what? What happened? What was different when the emergency managers left town? And we found, at best, modest response to crisis, no structural or service differences compared to neighbors. Short-term fixes were the approach of the day, and as soon as the emergency managers left town, it was returned to business as usual. We found these two studies and others like them not to be particularly inspiring in terms of the willingness or ability of local officials to make dramatic changes to their services and structures in the wake of economic crisis. And so we asked a third question. Okay, if local officials can't or won't do this, what about the state's role? Do they have something that could be played here? And so in the paper, Pulling the Lever, Rick Morse and I basically tried to begin to address the question. We have a long ways to go, and I'm just going to highlight where we are. But we surveyed all municipal association and county association directors across the country to find out what their states were proposing to do, if anything, and what they had accomplished in two areas. Bottom-up strategies, what we called the carrot, if you will, encouraging cross-boundary approaches, using regional bodies, financial incentives for collaboration, legalizing procedures for changing local structure, or liberalizing rather, financial support for local planning and implementation studies for shared or consolidated services, and technical assistance. We've talked about several of those in the context of New York today. And in fact, New York is one of those, what we call carrot states. There are also stick strategies, top-down, from the governor and the legislature. Mandated shifts of services to counties, mandated regional cooperation and service consolidation, efforts to eliminate or reduce so-called non-viable local governments, curtailing state aid eligibility, okay, and mandating service transfers to the state. So we did the survey of municipal league and county association directors. We did follow-up interviews with the staff to find out what was proposed, what had been considered, and if anything, what had been adopted. And we found some interesting examples across the country. There weren't a lot of them. We found 11 states that had reported doing some things, but as we kind of peeled away that onion, we really found only a handful that had done something that we consider kind of interesting and worthy of follow-up, which is the next phase of our research. I'm not going to go into all the details with respect to New York because we've already covered them very well, but I will say that we found New York's experience very interesting, and that was tied into a state-wide strategy embraced by not just the current governor, but by at least 2 and maybe 3 predecessor governors, as well as by the legislators. And in fact, that was a characteristic of some of the other states that we kind of singled out. But again, the transformative innovations, the local government performance and efficiency programs, as Lisa's mentioned, the Government Reorganization and Citizen Empowerment Act, to play a role, a facilitative role, providing funding, technical assistance, support for one-time expenditures, easing the procedures for dissolution and the like, were noteworthy. Okay? Some other examples, just to provide a context. New York's not the only state. Michigan has a competitive grant assistance program. Again, $44 million were provided in the first 4 founding rounds, which is kind of interesting. Chris from the Association of Towns was mentioned yesterday, $150 million was put on the table. So that's kind of another context in terms of where New York is in terms of serious money. Ohio is another state which had the kind of an interesting approach here, again, to promote efficiency, collaboration, and shared service projects. What's the rest of the story here? Well, okay, what are some of the assumptions that are made by the governors? One of the assumptions is there's a large number of small local governments that are inefficient and contribute to heightened property taxes. And reducing that number or greater sharing of their service responsibilities will save money and reduce some of the pressures on property taxes. Okay? Other context, and we heard this especially in Ohio from the Ohio Municipal League. They said, you need to realize what the legislature and the governor have done to municipalities in Ohio. They've eliminated local discretionary aid. They have cut back on state aid for shared services, state and local services, and they have shifted service burdens to local governments. So by comparison, putting a few $1 million on the table to encourage sharing studies and provide technical assistance, is maybe fine, but in the context of really the trend, which is called fend for yourself localism. Okay? Fend for yourself localism. Remember that, Chris? Okay, the stick approach. There are some interesting sticks out there, okay? One of which is pretty close here, New Jersey. The carrot approach goes back 3 governors, and it didn't succeed in keeping or putting the lid on property tax increases. The governor and the legislature have a number of things put in place. But one of the more interesting things is the New Jersey Local Unit Alignment, Reorganization, and Consolidation Commission, S2, which has been past the Senate since 2012, and not the House. But the idea is that studies are done to determine efficiency and tax savings through local unit consolidation. The recommendations of the study commission are presented to the governor and the legislature. Those go back to the local voters. If the local voters don't approve, then state aid is cut to an amount equal to the projected savings and efficiencies. That's the stick, right? Indiana, Governor Mitch Daniels basically wanted to abolish townships, proposed that, didn't get anywhere. But an Indiana Commission on Local Government Reform has 1/3 of its recommendations approved, including transferring township assessing duties to the county assessor, and 180 township assessors lost their jobs. Okay? So these are just examples. There are more of them, but not many more. Here are the conclusions that we've reached in a preliminary way. Okay? Most of what we've seen in terms of the response to economic crisis, we would label conventional and incremental, not bold or innovative. There are exceptions, because these are broad generalizations, but we haven't seen a whole lot out there because the risks outweigh the rewards. We all know that. Transformational change is tough. Core service elimination, expanding partnerships, jurisdictional realignment, require overcoming turf, trust, and time barriers. And it's very, very difficult. Here's what we found in virtually every conversation with state leaders. We don't trust, or with local, municipal league and county association leaders, we don't trust the state. They are not partners, they are adversaries. Okay? The cavalry is not going to come over the horizon from the Capitol to rescue local governments. And the assistance that we're getting provided to encourage our studies of sharing and consolidation is token relative to the bottom line impact of the cuts in aid and shifting of service burdens. The phrase shift and shaft describes what, in the view of the associations, the legislatures and governors are doing to the state, to the local governments, not for local governments. We found 11 states that had tried a carrot and stick approach. Only 4 were part of a broader gubernatorial legislative strategy to, whether it was to put a lid on property taxes, whether it was to achieve savings, whether it was to provide a higher service level through sharing, and the like. Most have tried, have failed due to local opposition. You're talking about some very influential governors like a Mitch Daniels. Got absolutely nowhere. There is some support we discovered for state incentives, but again, it provides, the context is important. In a state like Ohio, that kind of feeling that I described in terms of the local association representatives makes it very difficult to take incentives seriously. I'll leave you to comment on the New York State approach. New Jersey has a similar kind of tension. So, we're not seeing much by way of statewide strategic agendas here with respect to local government structuring. We have found that universities can play very helpful roles in doing studies, but the local government structure we've learned is really resilient. And when I meet with managers at ICMA meetings, I congratulate them on kind of getting through the recession. That's kind of the good news. The bad news is that the structures and services, are not significantly different after the recession than they were before the recession, at least based on our research. So maybe service sharing is a strategy that's out there. I think it is. But beyond that, I don't see it. So finally, what are the implications? First one, if economic crisis doesn't drive widespread change through local initiation or state intervention, what's it going to do? Because we spend a lot of time talking about the need for change in the system of local government. Well, what's going to disrupt the local government status quo? If it's not bankruptcy, if it's not recession, and if it's not state intervention, what's next? There may be other things out there, but we probably need to look at that. I love that term. The area of fend for yourself localism may be on the horizon. Again, the Municipal League and County Association and town people we talked to, we're of one mind here that we're going to increasingly have to look out for ourselves. And again, the states are not partners in this venture. They're making it more difficult for us. So there was an interest in some renewed collaborative partnerships among local governments and with the state, but where do you begin? Again, should states be more aggressive catalysts for local service and structural changes, given their relationship with local governments? States haven't stepped up to the plate in any large number at this point, but should they be encouraged to do so? And if so, through what strategies, the carrot or the stick? So here's some recommendations that we're considering putting forward. If states want to be a partner in leveraging change, here are some things that they may want to consider. And we're testing the waters here with some of the state organizations now. Use a bottom-up carrot approach. The stick is just going to be resisted in a very serious way. Provide serious incentives and link to broad strategic initiatives. And going into a partnership saying, well, the system of local government is, the culprit here in terms of high property taxes, and the failure for local governments to collaborate, is a burden, may not be the best way to enter that conversation. It's the earlier conversation this morning around dispatch and emergency medical services. I thought was really interesting because I thought about these are functions that are ripe for collaboration, and maybe if there is some sharing in a serious way, the trust can be built among local governments over time and maybe move into some other areas. There may be some areas that are ripe for local state collaboration. I don't have examples, but in any event, if the states are serious about this, our view is they have to be in it for the long haul. It just can't be kind of a quick fix in the wake of serious cutbacks to local government. It has to be much more strategic, much more sustainable. And actually, the 4 states that we have looked at, the interest has sustained itself. It has survived transitions in the governorship, and that is no mean feat. And so we're going to be, in terms of the next phase of our research, digging down into especially New York and New Jersey and looking for the work like it's already been presented to kind of see how these initiatives have fared and how especially local governments have reacted to them and what they see as the next direction for the state-local partnership. Thanks.
I want to thank the Institute for having me. I'm going to discuss the New York State Financial Restructuring Board for Local Governments. Before I do any slides, I just want to give you a little background on where I come from. I've spent a lot of time doing management, operational audits of utility companies, where we'd be out in the field. We might be in the middle of Brooklyn all night looking at some operation and coming up with real recommendations. And then we had to come up and make sure the recommendations were implemented. And that's really the focus of what I'm talking about here. So I'm a real focused presentation on the implementation of whatever recommendations they come up with. Now, I do have a little background here. Some of this we've been through already. The board was formed in 2013. It has a budget of about $2.5 million. It can give out grant money. There's a lot of very important players on this board. From the division of the budget, they kind of run it. Controller's office, the Attorney General, the Department of State. And there's additional members. Just for time, I didn't list them all here. Now, just a couple things on this. This board is separate. This isn't the property tax cap or freeze mechanism that you heard discussed this morning. So I just wanted to discuss that. If you look at the operations of the board, they discuss shared services agreements, but a lot of that has to do with the 1% property tax freeze that was discussed this morning. So this is a separate board. And then the other one, this isn't the fiscal stress system for New York State run by the Controller's office. They have a whole system you're going to hear about, I believe, in the next panel. So you're going to hear the term fiscal stress, but it's used by this board in a different manner. So I just want to differentiate from those two. Now, the way this works, there's about 1,600 local governments, and they have written into their law that if you have certain metrics that are worse than 75% of all the other local governments, then you're called fiscally stressed, and then you can apply to the board. So if you look at some of the numbers, there's about 368 governments on this fiscal stress list now. That's just math. It's about 23% of the 1,600. So if you look at the controller's fiscal stress list, it's a lot shorter, but it's a different method to get on their list. So if you're termed fiscally stressed by this board, you're allowed to apply here for a review. And what's going to happen is the Financial Review Board will produce a comprehensive review report with corrective actions suggested. These are like little management audits. They're about 25, 30 pages long. I find them very useful. If we look at who has I know there's some of the people in this room work for some of these organizations. There's a list of them. So right now, they have like 7 management audits out there. I'm calling them management audits that have different recommendations in them. And what I find interesting, and what I hope will come out of this board, is we could look at the 7 groups of recommendations and see if we can transport them to other governments. That's what I'm hoping will happen here. So those are the 7 that have completed, they've had completed reviews already. Then there's a group of governments that are still before the board, and hopefully there'll be more applying for this. So we've got 7 groups, there's 7 governments where there's some recommendations. And I think it's really worthwhile to study them. I'm trying to study the recommendations and find out if they were really implemented or not. And, maybe not all of them would be implemented. You may try to implement something and it doesn't work. But the focus is on the recommendations from these 7 governments. Like I said, these are the ones that are before the board now. Now, I only have a few minutes here, so I just took some of the recommendations and discussed them. I think there's about 46 recommendations if you tear the reports apart. So I just took some of them that I thought were interesting for different governments. Albany's can get a $3.9 million grant for Harriman campus redevelopment. So that's like an economic development grant. There's a lot of those before this board. The city of Fulton has them. There's different ones. Economic development grants here. And the city of Albany can get a $1.1 million information technology grant. Now that to me seems really useful. That's something, if we studied how it got implemented, we might be able to use it for other governments. And the city of Rochester has a whole bunch of operational efficiencies: fleet management, energy efficiency, health insurance costs, and workforce improvement. So what that means is there should be some kind of an implementation of all these different items, and we should be able to study it and figure out if it works, and maybe we can use it for other governments. A smaller entity before the board was the village of Alfred. There's a dissolution proposal. But then they want to combine the Alfred University Police Department with the village of Alfred, or whatever it's left there, to improve public safety. Then a couple other ones, the City of Jamestown and Chicago County Police Consolidation, that's a proposal. Then another one I find very interesting is the City of Jamestown, a Department of Public Works maintenance software upgrade required. So there's going to be some kind of a project going on out there about DPW software. Now, I don't know if the other 1,600 governments have problems there, but if we could study how this gets implemented and how it works, if there's 100 of them that have the same problem, we could bring it to them and we could improve local government. Then the City of Jamestown coordination of purchasing function with the school district purchasing. Like I said, the City of Fulton is another one that has a lot of redevelopment industrial parcels. There's an old Nestle plant up there. And then another interesting one for me coming from utilities, the town of Fishkill is to consolidate 12 water and sewer districts. And then they have the police department consolidation again. If you look at the board itself, remember I'm focusing on the recommendations. There's a lot of other recommendations that I didn't get into the detail of. The multi-year financial planning is required. There's shared services agreements, land bank programs, and then dissolutions of small governments. There's been 2 of those proposed. So what's the outcome of this? What am I trying to get from this? And I think I said this already. I'd like to see how are the recommendations to be implemented and how to prove they've been implemented. Like I've worked on tons and tons of management and operational audits for utilities, and when you write up a recommendation, they'd love to write you a letter back in a few weeks saying, gee, your ideas are good, but we've already implemented them and everything's okay. Well, that's not how it worked. We had to re-audit the utilities and make sure they implemented the program. Sometimes it might take from 1 to 5 years if it was a long-term proposal. And then we would have to have an affirmative vote by the Public Service Commission that the recommendation was implemented based upon our follow-up audits. So I hope that they do something like this. I've suggested it to the board. I don't know if they're going to do this, but I would recommend that they do something like this. And then the board itself, they have a really great website. It has all the management audits on it. But they could have a new document, which could, I would think of it as a set of best implemented recommendations that the board could publish periodically and say, this is a good recommendation. Let's think of the DPW software one that was implemented, and this is how it worked, and this is the cost benefits from it and all that. So the board itself, I think, could put out some nice reports as it matures about the implementation of different types of recommendations. Okay, there's also, just briefly, there's a collective bargaining function. You can come before the board. I'm really not focused too much on that. There haven't been any recommendations about that. And that's it. So if you have any questions on any of this, like I said, there's 7 management audits you may want to start to read that are all on the website, and they've got a lot of useful information. Okay.
Questions? Chris? You guy in the middle there.
Chris Anderson, Association of Towns. Lisa, you mentioned that the dissolutions are often framed in terms of property tax levy savings. Did you look at aggregate town-village levy amounts prior and then parent town levy amounts post for the executed dissolutions? There were only 11 or so?
No, that's what I want to do next, is actually look at, on the other side of the successful cases, measure them afterwards to look for that. Most of the studies, a lion's share has been done by CGR of the actual plans when there's a consulting board hired. And I looked sort of...
Those are just the plans,
Those
right?
are just the plans, and I looked at those, and they almost uniformly project some small increase for town outside of village voters and savings for within the village. But that's the next step, is to go and actually see down the road, how did it translate to savings? And were they sustainable over time?
It's John Batchelor. This question mostly, I think, for Dr. Stenberg. When I think about this discussion, it strikes me that I'm confused by the entry point for the efficiency issue, and that is that it seems to assume that shared services is the primary solution to the problem. And when I look at what I hear coming out of it, I hear that nobody seems to be talking about the cost of education. In New York State, I don't see any discussion of really how the shared services approach would relate to that. Secondly, when I think about it, it seems that much of what's focused on relates to very small parts of local government costs. Things like assessing. I served on the state assessing board for quite a long time. We went through that process and did a whole series of studies and looked at the potential for savings by consolidation, and the result was that the savings would be nil. So I guess the question is, are we thinking about this question in the right way?
We might not. I think one of the reasons why the large number of small local governments is kind of put out there as a problem is to capture public attention and maybe build some support for initiatives. And I think the assumption is through either transferring functions from dissolved local governments to larger units, or alternatively finding ways to share services will produce some efficiencies, just as consolidation will produce efficiencies, and I think that hasn't been demonstrated in either case. So that's one of the frustrations. I think there are really important sharing opportunities, but it may not be to save a lot of money. It may be to build some interlocal collaboration and trust that would enable local governments to move from, some of the services that have been mentioned, your 9/11 to planning and things like that, to maybe get into the big ticket services, fire, police, EMS, whatever, to see if there are some opportunities there. But those aren't going to be possible until you kind of have that base level of trust that I think doesn't exist in at least a lot of the places that I'm familiar with, and was mentioned this morning in terms of the two counties, basically here, they don't talk to one another out in the Buffalo area. And I think I see that all the time in North Carolina. And so we got to get over that, I think, before we can move into the bigger cost-saving potential areas, because they, by definition, are going to be more controversial, and especially in a unionized environment. The other thing going on is kind of this best practice and efficiency interest. I didn't mention this in the case of New Jersey as another component of its stick approach. The Department of Community Services has put out a best practices inventory that all municipalities receiving state aid have to fill out. It's a series of 50 questions. Are you doing this? Are you doing that? The number one question, are you exploring shared services with other localities? And if you answer no, you get penalized in your final state aid payment, 5%. So, I mean, there is that assumption that not only is the large number of local governments inefficient, especially townships and villages, the smaller ones, but there's also that assumption that local operations can be made more efficient through whatever best practices are out there.
Just to follow up on that, I would follow those 7 audits that I had up there, because I didn't emphasize this in my talk, but there's a whole shared services dialogue in most of those audits. It'll be similar to the one we saw for Albany County today. So all those big cities, Rochester, there's talks in there about shared services agreements, and the Financial Restructuring Board is promoting them.
There's too much to say. I mean, the fact is that all those things have been done in New York, and there are consequences. They just haven't been done in those places. So in addition to seeing the outcomes from those recommendations, it'd be interesting to see, and Michael's actually studied this for highway stuff, see what other places have done and how they can be directly applied. So if the board was making a recommendation, it would not only be do this, but it would be go look at Chautauqua County, because they did this. And I don't know if that's being done. The second thing on schools, So kind of separate question, because this has been a discussion of general purpose governments, but we've published on that and demonstrated that consolidation is a strategy for only a very limited number of jurisdictions and a limited number of circumstances. But this whole shared service discussion arises from frustration about eliminating numbers of governments. It's a kind of a second best strategy for governors. From my point of view, governors targeting elimination of governments is a massively bad idea, and is a presumption that drives analytic thinking or drives studies that's inappropriate. You know, it's a potential outcome, but it shouldn't be the premise going in. And on Lisa's point, we have a very interesting example in the Hudson Valley of a Hasidic Jewish community essentially co-opting a village. And you see that the main defense of small villages under 500 as a cutoff is that they are communities. And when the people who live there now find themselves unable to define community because of the influx of a different population with different values and so on, one of their primary responses is to try to dissolve their village. So this raises interesting questions about the idea of community and its importance for sustaining the municipality. Just a few thoughts.
I think we have a question.
Ken Bohn. I'm a partner with Squire Patton Boggs. I'm a bond attorney and an adjunct professor at Albany Law School. I teach state and local government finance law. I came up to this program today because I was interested to see that all these issues are being discussed again, because I go back, I don't know how many years, when Albany Law School was doing a sort of a pilot shared services program with a small grant from the, I think, Department of State. And I was helping them fill out the applications and what did you think your savings would be over 5 years. Some of you may be familiar with that. And from what I'm hearing today, it sounds as if you've taken that and just been regurgitating a lot of this data to come up with a bunch of audits and projections through this program, the governor's program, which result in some sort of isolated instances of consolidation or dissolution of a village here. So, and I guess I would just like to bring to everybody's attention an important United States Supreme Court case from 1974, which you may know. It's Milliken versus Bradley. Milliken versus Bradley is a case in which the Detroit school system attempted to get the outlying suburban school districts to merge with it on the basis that having all the white folks out in the suburbs and all the black folks in the city violated equal protection based on race. And the United States Supreme Court reversed the case and said, you know, if it was done through some law, that would be one thing. But if it's just a factual thing that happens, we can't help you out as a matter of law for the courts. And I raise that point because I'm sure you're all familiar with the Detroit bankruptcy. And if that case had gone the other way, and the school systems and the municipalities in Detroit had consolidated into a large metropolitan area, as New York City is, for example, we probably wouldn't have had the deterioration of the city of Detroit. Now take that to New York. There are probably 10 cities, small cities, after the big 5 or 6, who are in terrible financial shape because they cannot tax the tax base of the surrounding suburban towns. The problem to me, in my view, is not the stuff you're talking about, but a state-mandated requirement that the cities and surrounding towns in the state merge into large metropolitan areas and act as large units of government. Because the notion that these struggling cities can support the dependent populations while the mainly white folks, and I'm a conservative Republican, I'll be happy to admit this right away, while the mainly white folks are sitting in the suburbs in their split-level homes and not having any responsibility for the services in the city, it is patently ridiculous. And yet, this is in front of us. It's been in front of us for 20 or 30 years. The problem is getting worse, and we don't talk about it. We don't do anything about it. So I'd like members of the audience and the panel to address that issue of why we are not mandating large metropolitan governments around our central cities throughout New York State as an economic development driver and as a way to provide a better life for everybody that lives in those metropolitan areas.
Any response?
Well, we have a lot of audits of large cities, and there's a great group of people working on those audits. They could certainly take an idea like that and propose it.
Well, why hasn't it been brought up before? Yeah. Why isn't it being discussed?
I don't have the answer. I'm just saying.
It's right in front of our noses. It has been for 2 decades.
I'm just saying, if you wanted to study the proposal, I really think the Financial Restructuring Board would consider something like that. I don't see where they have considered it, but it sounds like an idea they could look at and explore.
There are mechanisms in New York State for, at the county level, to force consolidation, but that requires a tripartite sort of approval of referendum. This came up in the Williamsville dissolution because it's the first-ring suburb of Buffalo, and that was one of the, in the debate, that was one of the dissolution proponents' arguments, is to promote regionalism through this consolidation. And you just run smack dab into that idea of we're our own community. In many cases, these communities don't want to accept or admit that there's an exclusivity, the ability to zone, the kind of promoting a certain lifestyle. And it was you could see it in the actual community meetings. You could see citizens being confronted with that idea that it's better for Buffalo, but they don't want to give up what they have in Williamsville. And so there's a psychological attachment that goes beyond what the law allows.
Next question.
I think that you've put the point right on the head, Ken, that this is Mildred Warner from Cornell University. Is the appropriate question, Carl, efficiency or effectiveness? Because if it's about efficiency and the lowest cost government, we might have the lowest cost government with our fragmented system. But if it's about effectiveness, addressing the issues of education or regional equity, then these kinds of voluntary, low-hanging fruit, shared services approaches probably aren't going to get us there. We've done a statewide study of all the local governments in the state on sharing, and we discovered that sharing is least where it's most needed. And it is most unlikely in areas where you have diversity among municipalities in a county. So whether that's diversity by income, by tax base, by race, or by age, you're less likely to see sharing in those counties. So the notion that voluntary approaches to get to equity, you're not going to see that. So I think that the issue, you're asking for some kind of bold change at a time of fiscal stress, and everybody focuses to efficiency. But if you switched your question to effectiveness, you might really ask if some kind of radical rethink of what local government looks like is in order, and it might not lead with an efficiency discussion, it might lead with an effectiveness one.
Comment on that?
Let me see if there are any other questions, because we're going to be close to the end of the session here. Anybody else back here?
Hi, John Rodat. My question was going to be addressed to Ms. Parshall, but then after Ken's discussion, I decided to modify it a bit. In your presentation, you talked about the increased functional parity of counties, towns, and villages. And my instant thought was, why are counties in that list? At least in New York, because functionally, to my observation, they're quite different. They are, in New York, counties are predominantly responsible for what are human services, social welfare functions that are typically handled in other states by state government itself. So I don't understand how counties fit in that statement. But then, of course, Ken said what he did, and at least theoretically, counties would be the natural place that you would get some migration, some multi-level consolidation. So I wonder if you could respond to that overly complex pair of observations.
I would have to stretch my memory banks back to when I was looking at that particular piece. It's been a while, but yeah, when I was looking at why I included counties in there was for that reason. Yes, they're general purpose governments, but I was looking at the long view of why incorporate a village. And a lot of that changed after the town law changes and counties are granted greater authority in New York State. And so the reasons for village incorporation have just diminished over time in terms of the ability to provide services to a densely populated area. On the second part of your question, could you remind me again what that second point was? What was it that flipped your...
Well, if counties in New York don't really function in manners that are similar to cities, towns, and villages, if they are much more like the state government than those other local governments, then what might be the unit that we should focus on in response to Ken's suggestion that we need more regionalized forms of government?
I think the city-county consolidation issue is an interesting one, and again, I'd have to stretch my memories as to what in our law is allowed under authorized in terms of county consolidation. But again, I think in New York State, the protection has been for smaller municipalities, local autonomy over their fate. And so again, you would have difficulty, I think, overcoming the local attachment.
In many other places, counties are natural regional governments. The question is, do they have the capacity and the commitment to expand their service portfolio beyond what's mandated by the state? In North Carolina, we have 100 counties. Everyone has a county manager. At least 15 of those counties are labeled dying. More people are leaving than are being more people are dying than are being born. More people are leaving than are arriving. Kids are leaving as soon as they graduate from high school. Businesses aren't going there. And so what capacity do they have, even if they have a commitment to shoulder more responsibilities? So but I would say that counties in many places do have that potential. And again, whether it's a service sharing or a consolidation strategy that you have in mind.
Thank you. We're going to take another 10-minute break and finish with our last panel. Can we give our panel a hand?